Good evening, this is Whiskey Zero, Delta Delta Zulu. My name is Dave, and I will be net control for tonight's Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. This net is brought to you by the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club. It's also streamed online at youtube.com/NCARC. It's also stored there, so if you want to catch back up later. Tonight we're going to be talking about soldering. Soldering is definitely something that we get to dabble with as amateur radio operators, and it's something that doesn't take too much to get good at. As long as you have the proper tools and the proper techniques, you can generally get a pretty good solder joint. And I wanted to discuss some of that. We will start by taking check-ins. If you'd like to check into tonight's net, please call.
This is Kilo Echo Zero, Uniform Foxtrot Hotel, Matt in Loveland.
Kilo Alpha 6, Echo Tango Echo, Jim, Loveland.
This is Kilo Echo Zero, Lima, Charlie, Kilo. The other Mike from Windsor.
Zero, Mike India Zulu, Rob, Owl Canyon.
This is Alpha Echo Zero, Charlie Foxtrot, Ben from Collins.
Steve from Fort Collins.
Okay, good evening to KE0, UFH, Matt, KA6ETE, Jim, KE0, LCK, Mike, MIZ. I only got your suffix, Rob. Could you come back with your full call?
E0, Kilo Echo Zero, Mike India Zulu.
Thank you, Rob, and good evening. We also had AE0CF, Ben, and Steve. You doubled with Ben. I did not get your call sign. Would you come back with your call sign?
KE0, Uniform X-Ray, Quebec, Steve.
And good evening to Steve. Any other check-ins for the Monday TechNet, please call.
This is Whiskey Zero, Alpha Sierra Papa, W0ASP, Terry in Burzard.
This is Kilo Zero, Lima Alpha Oscar, and Kilo Zero Papa Romeo Bravo, Luann and Phil in Loveland.
Good evening to W0ASP, Terry, K0LAO, Luann, and K0PRB, Phil. Any other check-ins for the Monday TechNet, please call.
Kilo Charlie Zero, Romeo Bravo Tango.
This is Alpha Echo Zero Golf Mike, George and Bertha.
Good evening to KC0RBT. That is Jim, am I correct?
I apologize for that. You are correct, Jim, in Fort Collins.
I thought so. We've talked a couple of times, so it was definitely testing my memory, though. Good evening, Jim. And AE0GM, George, good evening. Any other check-ins for the TechNet, please call.
Kilo 0 Alpha Romeo Delta, Ann in Fort Collins.
Good evening, K0ARD, Ann. And we'll make this the last call for pre-check-ins. If anyone else would like to check in, and you can check in anytime during the net, just jump in there if you have some input for us. Last call for pre-net check-ins. Please call.
This is Kilo 1 Delta Echo Golf, Mike in Platteville.
This is Kilo Echo 0 Uniform Tango Foxtrot, Scott and Brighton.
And good evening to K1DEG Mike and KE0UTF Scott. Was that correct?
Readback is correct.
Very good, and good evening. So, soldering is definitely a pretty interesting subject. I know when I started soldering for the first time, it did not turn out very good, but I did not know very much about it, and I only had one of those little pen soldering irons that plug directly into the mains, and I had some pretty thick solder, and it just didn't go the way I thought it would go. So it took some learning about it, but after some learning, I got pretty good at soldering and can usually do a pretty nice job at soldering. So I hadn't seen that we had ever talked about it before, so I wanted to kind of give some input and kind of cover some of the stuff that I've learned and some of the stuff that I have, and I'm sure there's plenty of the guys in the net that are much better than I am at soldering and have done a lot more. So I hope that we get quite a good conversation out of this tonight. Anybody who here has a soldering station that they love? Give me a call with your suffix real quick.
SB.
So that is one of the first things and mistakes that I made when I first started was getting one of those little pen soldering irons that was, frankly, it was just crap. And it did not do a great job for me. I personally ended up researching quite a bit about soldering irons after that, and learned that you really need a good soldering station. They're not terribly expensive either for a quality soldering station, and what kind of differentiates the soldering station is that it has a control box. You can control the temperature on that box and set the temperature for whatever you need from the solder, and different solders definitely do better at different temperatures. I ended up going with a Hacko FX888D, and that is a pretty solid soldering station. It gets pretty high marks from what I found. And I've also heard some pretty good things about Weller stations that are out there. Those are two brand names that I'm definitely familiar with. Getting a quality station, a brand name station, is also a good idea. It definitely gives you better results, more consistent temperatures. The temperatures are more correct and work consistently. Somebody was in there with a station they love. Does anybody have any thing they want to add about soldering stations? Please call.
KB0TYU.
Pete in Windsor.
I had a bit of a double in there. Joe, I got you, and there was another station that doubled with Joe. Will you come back one more time for me?
Yeah, it's N0PQ, November 0, Papa Quebec, Pete in Windsor.
Thanks, Pete. Let's start with Joe, KT0TYU. Go ahead.
Thanks for taking the net. Dave, I've got what they call it's called an Xtronic, and to be honest with you, the only thing I know is the thing is actually made in Nebraska. Now, I got it either on eBay or Amazon. It's a digital. Well, it's one that turns on immediately, and it's heat controlled and all that on a stand. I really like it. I tell you, I did the same thing you did. I bought a bunch of those little guys and fought it, and then I got this thing, and even James likes it, so it's got to be good. Back to you.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, I have. I've not heard of Xtron, but I know that there's quite a few really good soldering station brands. I'm only super familiar with the Hacko because I've owned it, and I have seen several people that own the Weller, and I've had mine for years, and I've seen those Wellers last years, and so yeah, those are the only brands. So I appreciate you pitching in on different brands, because I always love to hear about stations. I know I think I paid right about $100 for my Hacko. What did you pay for yours, Joe?
I think it was more than $40, to be honest with you.
See, and that is a great price too. Thanks, Joe. N0PQ, Pete, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. A little bit of background. This is kind of a religious issue for me, to be honest. I'm an electrical engineer. I've been doing this for, 30 years professionally and almost 50 as an amateur. But The only soldering iron I use is made by Metcal. Metcal, I think, got bought by OK. Metcals were the only thing we were allowed to use in production at least a couple of companies I've worked for. Downside is they're very expensive. You can usually pick them up on eBay, and they're not too bad. But new, they're really expensive. But boy, it makes a difference.
U0 ASP with a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I think those Metcal soldering irons are some kind of RF inductive heating, whereas my typical Weller LD1 soldering station is just a basic heat conduction soldering iron. Anybody care to comment on that?
W0 LED.
Good evening, Dave. Please go ahead.
Yeah, the Metcals are RF heated tip. They operate in the ISM band around 13.56, just below our 20-meter band. They do produce some undesirable RFI, but it's minor, and considering if you're operating on the air, you probably don't have the soldering pin on. Yeah, out of any of them, and I've used them all, professionally and by myself, Metcal is just sweet. And you can buy various tips to fit the application, anywhere from very small surface mount to removing complete dual inline 14-16 pin ICs. They're sweet. Yep, RF 13.56 megahertz. W0 LED.
LAO.
Yeah, Luann, go ahead.
Well, I'm not very good at soldering myself, but Phil has a Weller butane soldering kit that he uses all the time in Star Drive, and it works really well. So that's also a really good kit.
Oh, yes. The butane soldering iron is great for portable soldering. Anybody else? I was going to say one of the things that really you get with the dollars spent on like a better quality station like a Metcal is the ability to leave the soldering station on for an all-day sort of application versus some cheaper, more consumer stations that you would do your bit of soldering and then turn it off. The design behind some of the more expensive stations will allow you to run them all day long. Did anybody else have any input on soldering stations?
WA5VRL Fort Collins.
Hey, good evening, Willis. Go ahead.
Good evening. I'll second Dave's recommendation for Metcal. We used them a lot where I used to work, and then more recently, in the last few years before I left there and retired, we changed over to another brand called JBC, Juliet Bravo Charlie basically the same thing. It's 13.56 megahertz RF energized. Anyway, both of them are extremely good, and the variety of tips you can get is quite large, and it's certainly worth it. But like I think Dave and some of the others mentioned, when you look at Metcal or JBC, they're quite pricey for amateurs. I just happen to have one here at home, but that's because I got it on discount through the company where I worked at the time, the JBC anyway. But one thing that needs to be said about the soldering, whether you're using Metcal, JBC, Weller, Hacko, whatever, if you want to do any good, it's practice, practice, practice. Otherwise, you will not get there. There's no shortcuts.
U0ASP with a question.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
For Willis and maybe for W0LEV, Dave, I've never used one of these RF-enabled soldering irons, and I just used some pretty high-end Weller products and some heat guns. But do the RF products require touching the tip to the component, or do they heat by an area of effect?
Now, actually, in the stand, the tip is hot itself. You don't want to touch it, just like a resistibly heated tip. But the neat part of it is, when you touch it to what you're going to solder, the power can ramp up or ramp down. Well, the power can ramp up depending upon how much conductor is connected to the tip. So, in reality, the thing really uses minimal energy. You can solder some pretty big things with it with the right tip. They're quite amazing. W0LEV.
This is Whiskey Zero, Delta Delta Zulu. My name is Dave with the Monday Tech Net. Any other questions or comments about soldering stations that anybody wants to add? Please.
Yeah, N0PQ, just a comment on the Metcal and how it works. It's actually kind of interesting. It delivers RF to the tip, and then the tip heats up. As the tip heats up, it reaches the Curie point of one of the materials in there, and that's what regulates the temperature. So I'm not sure if it's going in and out of resonance or exactly how that works, but there's some good info online if you search for it.
W0ASP, I'm actually looking for some experience for someone who's used both the RF heated tips and are normally thermally heated tips as to how the soldering experience is different between the two.
N0PQ here again. To me, it's day and night. The difference is that the power delivered with an RF tip like that is almost instant. So you can take a tip, and it's regulating temperature, and put it on a big piece of metal, like a coax connector, and it basically will heat it up almost instantly. It has very little delay.
Yeah, another difference I've noted in using the resistively heated tips, the interchangeable tips, the heat is regulated magnetically. there's a little element in there, and you can hear it click when it turns on, turns off to maintain the heat. It's not like the Metcal where it delivers the amount of energy to the tip, RF energy, that's needed. Rather than an on-off, it's continuously adjustable and it's transparent to the user. Take my word for it, if you know how to solder, number one, if you know how to solder and you've used both, you'll never leave the Metcal.
And W0ASP. How does that compare to hot air guns?
Different ones in my home lab. So you're welcome to come check it out sometime if you want.
Sorry, Pete, I think we had a bit of a double. W0ASP Terry asked how that would compare to a heat gun, a hot air heat gun.
Soldering and a reflow oven. LEV.
No, we actually had almost perfect double. We'll get responses from both of you. I think I got both of you that were in there. Let's start with Pete, N0PQ. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm guessing we probably said exactly the same thing anyway. But, I mean, hot air has its uses, mostly for surface mount rework and removal especially, and also to some extent soldering down surface mount parts. But it's not very practical for normal, through-hole soldering joints or soldering wires and that sort of thing. Another thing, I think I got doubled the other time I mentioned this, but I have 3 of these things in my lab in my house. So if somebody wants to try one before they fork out the money to buy one, let me know.
Yeah, I may have to take you up on that, Pete, because they're definitely sounding interesting, and I've not heard of them myself. So I was definitely going to do some more investigating into it. Dave, W0LEV, did you want to add to what Pete said about hot air versus the Metcal radio inductive is what I think we called it? Go ahead.
No, the Metcal is RF heated. It's not necessarily inductive, it's a resonant system. The hot air stuff, hot air gun, is really aimed at pretty much strictly surface mount. And it will replicate both in soldering and desoldering surface mount components in a very small area what the circuit board would experience in a reflow oven. It's not meant for soldering wire to wire. It's strictly aimed at surface mount. W0LEV.
W0ASP with a follow-on, if I might.
Yeah, absolutely, Terry. Go ahead.
Sorry to dig this kind of deep, but I'm very curious into this RF soldering technology. And is it well applied to surface mount soldering?
Terry, you can use it for surface mount with the appropriate tip. That's one of the beauties of the thing. There are a multitude of tips available for the Metcal, all heated in a similar manner. You can get wide chisel tips up to, I believe, a ½ inch in diameter. I'm sorry, a ½ inch in length on the chisel. Or little tiny tips that are even useful for 06, 03 and a little bit smaller surface mount. That's the beauty of the Metcal. Well, one of them.
It's N0PQ. There's also hand pieces that are like tweezers available, which again you can use either paddles or small tips. So you can pick up chip components, or you can like SOICs, pull them off very easily.
Yes, and this is actually a good time to work into another part that I wanted to talk about, which was the tips. Most of a lot of the soldering irons and stations that you'll buy end up coming with a conical tip, and it comes to a nice point. And there are some uses for that particular tip, but I personally have changed mine for a 2mm chisel, and that has definitely helped with transferring the heat to where it needs to be. And we've talked a little bit about some tips here and the multitude of tips that are available for the various soldering stations that are out. And that is one of the things that it's very important that you choose the right tip for the job. I know the Hacko station, I know it because it's what I have, and I know there's a multitude of tips for it. I don't believe that it has tweezers, though, and it sounds like the Metco, you said, Pete, comes with tweezers. Is that correct?
Well, they're available. It doesn't really come with anything, but there's the upper end Metcal power supply has two outputs. So typically, what people do is one of them goes to a regular handpiece, the other goes to a pair of tweezers. I think some of the Hacko stuff also has tweezers available. There's a few different companies that have them. N0PQ.
Yes, thank you for correcting my wording. By comes with, I definitely meant available. They did not come with my station. I had to buy my the tip that I use on a regular basis is a different tip. Mine came with a conical tip, and I think that it was only about $6 for the tip, but that also varies between the tips. Does anybody else want to add anything about the tips or soldering station stuff that we've covered already? Please come back.
VRL.
Yeah, go ahead, Willis.
Yeah, there's too many different types of tips to cover in the net. I would suggest that if you're interested, go to the Metcal or the JBC websites, and you will get a complete list of all the stuff that's available for them. And most of the websites will also give you a basic description of what each type of tip is commonly used for. But it's easier to cover that info on the internet because it's such a large assortment available for both Metcal and JBC and probably some of the others.
Yeah, I agree. I would definitely follow up with anything you want to really know more about. And tips are definitely a huge portion of soldering. Having the correct tip for the job is huge. It changes the experience. It gets that heat into the spots where you want it quickly, and avoids and it does it quick enough that you avoid getting the heat to where you don't want it, and possibly having a problem like lifting a pad on a board. So yes, definitely look at the tips. One of the must-haves, I would say, is a chisel tip that's around 2 millimeters is going to be a good workhorse for everyone, I would say. Does anybody want to add any more or have any questions? Please call.
Speak.
Oh, that was pretty quick. I think it was Terry, though. Am I correct?
Sorry, Dave. W0ASP. I had a question as to what's the basic price of a Metcal soldering station?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I'd like to know also. Anybody able to give us an idea of that?
Yeah, it's Pete again, N0PQ. I believe new, they are in the $2,000 range for the higher-end version. They have a less expensive one that's on the order of $600-700. But the best thing to do is buy a used one on eBay, because they pretty much, the power supply part, the expensive part, pretty much lasts forever. And as electronics companies go bankrupt, their power supplies, their soldering stations end up on eBay. And I've seen those for, a couple $100 for a good working one.
Yeah, that is a good suggestion to everyone, too, is to look for the commercial equipment on eBay, because you do find that stuff on eBay as companies go out of business or upgrade their equipment. They will try to recover whatever they can out of it. Any other questions about tips or soldering stations? Please call.
Yeah, PRB.
Yeah, Phil, go ahead.
Oh, just it's funny, while you guys were talking about that, I was looking on Amazon, and there are some of these Metcals on Amazon for $250. Looks like $250 and up. So it definitely has a large range depending on what you need it for.
This is Whiskey Zero Delta Delta Zulu with the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club Monday TechNet. Yes, thanks, Phil. $250 and up is a good place to start for the Metcal, which is not too much more than I think I spent on my Hacko new. I could be wrong. I bought it so long ago. I don't really remember what I spent on it, but $100 for a soldering station is pretty cheap in my opinion, and a great soldering station for not too much more than that is not a bad deal if it's gonna last a really long time, and that's kind of what you look for out of it. And you also, obviously want it to do the best work possible, so a good soldering station is always a great investment. Any other questions or comments about soldering stations or tips? Please call.
VRL.
Yeah, go ahead, Willis.
Yeah,
Yeah, I was just going to mention, you're correct. The soldering station itself, Metcal, JBC, Wacko, whatever, should last many, many years. The tips have improved greatly over the last several decades as far as the metallurgy that they use and the construction of the actual tips. And if you take care of them as per normal instructions, they should also last quite a long time. So when you look at the total investment for a station, either new or used, and say maybe half a dozen, 5 or 6 of the most popular tips that you're going to need to use, and stretch that over the number of years that it'll probably last if you take care of it, it's not a bad deal.
Levy.
Yes, Dave, please go ahead.
Yeah, number one, I want to strongly reinforce Willis's comments. Another advantage of the Metcal, when it's sitting there just ready to be used, yeah, by itself, it's up to temperature, but it's not degrading the tip. It's not eating the tip like the thermally heated tips have in the past. It's pretty sweet in that respect. And I just checked eBay. Bottom end right now is $130. There's one on there for $160. That's a complete station with one tip. And they seem to come in from there around $250. That's a complete station again with tip. Just depends. W0LEV, and I need to go to the kitchen.
Well, thanks, Dave. I definitely appreciate it. I always love to hear from people that have more experience with the stuff than I do. I've definitely played a lot with soldering, but not nearly as much as a lot of these guys on this net. So I appreciate you guys giving us your expertise or lending us your expertise. Dave and Pete and Willis and everyone, thank you. Anything anybody else would like to add on tips or stations? I didn't catch the call. It was pretty quick, but please go ahead.
This is K0PRB. The other thing I want to add, and it's been very handy for me, I have a rework station, of course, with a hot air, and it also doubles as a shrinker for the heat shrink. Man, that's valuable to me. I've used the hot air gun on there many times for the heat shrink, doing different projects. So, you know, if anybody's considering whether or not they should get one with hot air, I would just for something like that. K0PRB.
You can quote, borrow, unquote your wife's hair dryer for shrink tubing.
Well, and you know, I was going to actually say that a good air station is not necessarily a bad thing to have. If you have like a Hacko soldering station, to have a good air station next to it is a pretty handy thing. Just being able to keep the areas around the board a good warm temperature before you start, so that there's less heat drain from it. And like some components, it's with a soldering iron like that or without a tweezer tip, it's hard to get the heat to both sides. So if you have a misplacement or just need to move a surface mount component to a better spot or whatnot, having the hot air station to be able to rework something is definitely a handy tool to have around. anything else anybody wanted to add about tips or soldering stations, please call.
ASP.
Go ahead, Terry.
Well, when it comes to surface mount work, I've had pretty good results with using a hot plate to heat the circuit board up to a basic temperature, say about 300 or 400 degrees, and then use a hot air gun to to melt the solder. And typically, I use this liquid solder. It's a mixture of flux and micro solder beads, and you can put it with a microscopic tip onto the plates where you're going to be assigning the different components. And then when you put the hot air to it, it will melt the solder, and then solder the SMA component to the pads, W0 ASP.
So I definitely don't have too much experience with the pastes. I have definitely used hot air, like reflow stations to get components loose on a board and to take like a surface mount component off of a board. And then I'll use solder wick and clean up the area, and then I will tin the pad with a regular I'll tin the pad and the component, and then I will heat it on and just end up heating it on one side at a time. But some hot air to, even if you were to tin both of the pads and then just use the hot air to basically do the same thing, would work also. But yeah, the professional answer, I would imagine, would be the tweezers to keep both sides of the device properly and evenly. But there's definitely ways to work around that. I haven't used the paste myself, but it sounds like Terry's definitely had some success with it. So that actually is a good lead into the next thing I kind of wanted to talk about, which was the solder itself. And this is definitely an interesting topic, or part of the topic. Some of the, well, let's start with the making, or the what type of solder to use. Let me let this drop for a second. So what I have traditionally used was the 60-40 solder, that is 60% tin, 40% lead solder, and I've used that for a very long time. And recently, well, in recent years anyhow, I have found Tectic solder, which is the 63% tin and 37% lead. And the biggest difference between that is how it melts. The eutectic solder has a single melting point. So the normal solder will go through two phases as it's heating up. It's in its solid phase, and it'll kind of go to a plastic phase, and then it will go to a liquid phase. And you have to heat it past the plastic phase all the way to the liquid phase in order to get a good solder joint. Otherwise, you get what's called the cold solder joint. The eutectic solder does not have the plastic phase. It goes directly from the solid phase to the liquid phase, and doesn't have that range where it has the plastic phase, and that makes it easier to, or I guess it would be harder to get those cold solder joints, because it goes, it bypasses that phase where it's very likely that you end up with a cold solder joint. So the 6337 has definitely been an advantage that I've found. Anybody want to add to that, please call.
Looking at my solders, W0ASP.
TUS.
Good evening, Mike. Go ahead.
KF4 TUS. My experience with cold solder. Undesirable resistance to the circuit, and I proved to a Norfolk State engineer that I could fix a particular piece of gear with a resistive network. That all I had to do was look for the cold solder joints, and I could fix that coupler, because otherwise it tries to make the servo gear go where it cannot physically go. And we had to be proficient in mill standard soldering for the Navy. Excuse me. And that's the great disadvantage of a cold solder joint. And if you encounter a piece of gear that you acquired secondhand, and it's gone through some travels across country or across state or across the town, you want to look for those solder joints where you see a ring around the wire of the component, and that will cause problems as well. But yeah, as far as the cold solder joint, the disadvantage is it'll add a resistance to the circuit that's very undesirable. K4 TUS.
Yes, thank you, Mike. There were a couple of points in there that you dropped out. I don't know if you have a bit more power to kick into that radio. It may help the transmission a bit, but yes, adding resistance to a circuit is one of the problems with cold solder joints that can have an undesired effect, as Mike was pointing out with a control circuit for a servo. That voltage, the overall voltage, is what controls the servo and tells it to go into a particular position. And because of the additional resistance in the circuit due to cold solder joints, it was trying to go to a position that was outside of the servo's capability of where it would go. So hopefully that servo had some kind of protection circuit to keep it from trying to go outside. Otherwise, it could possibly cause some damage to that servo. So cold solder joints are definitely a issue, and the best way to keep from having a cold solder joint is, as Dave said, practice, practice, practice. And the solder and understanding how the metallurgy works with any of the various solders is a good thing to do. The 6337 eutectic solder is a huge advantage, and definitely is great at not giving you cold solder joints and being a very easy solder to work with electric components, which and sometimes there's specialty needs by the electric components. I know that if they're the pads and the components themselves, either one has some silver in it, it's good to have a bit of silver in the solder. So there is a 6236-2, which is the 62% tin, 36% lead, and 2% silver, that is helpful for components that have silver in them. Another tip with solder that I would have is to use the finest possible solder that you can. The thinnest solder gives you... Well, I think I timed it out. The thinnest solder gives you the most control over how much solder you get into a joint. Does anybody else have anything they want to add about solder?
Ed, PQ again.
Pete, go ahead.
So yeah, I'll add a couple of comments. By far, the eutectic solder is the easiest to use, especially if you're trying to hold something in place, like a couple of wires. The fact that it goes from liquid to solid basically all at once makes it much easier to avoid burning your fingers. In general, I would try to avoid anything else, like the lead-free solders. They just don't work as well. They require a much higher temperature as well. The silver-bearing solders are useful in some cases, but in general, 6337 is the best. And then the next question is flux formulations and flux percentages, and that's a whole nother issue.
Yes, flux is very important to the mix, as the surface of the metal oxidizes. It causes problems with the bonding of the solder to the surface of the other metals that it's trying to bind. So the rosin or the flux is what the key component to keep that from giving us bad solder joints. I am not too familiar with the percentages. Pete, do you want to give us some of your thoughts on the percentage of flux?
Yeah, you know, I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head. If you go look at the catalog from somebody like Kester Solder or Multicore, which, by the way, being a snob, are the only ones I use, you'll see that there's not only, typically for wire solder, you'll find maybe 3 different percentages by volume or by weight of flux to solder. And you'll also find a whole mess of different flux formulas. And they vary in activity, which is essentially how corrosive they are, and a few other things, like what they can be cleaned with, if they're soluble in water, alcohol, or something else. So it's tough, right? It's tough to pick the right one. In general, in terms of flux content, I think the middle of the range is about right for most uses. And in terms of formulation, Normally, mildly active RMA is probably the most common. The more active ones are good if you're dealing with a lot of corroded metal, and less active if it's a very sensitive circuit.
Great info on the rosin, yeah, or the solder, the flux, I'm sorry. Yeah, and I was going to give a couple of tips on the residue that's left after by the flux that's in there. Can definitely be a problem, especially if you have the high reactive stuff, as Pete pointed out. So it is a good idea to have some electronic complete cleaning solvent and get the residue off of the board after you've completed the soldering job, or get the residue off of the components, the board, whatever is wherever it's left. It's good to clean that stuff off. I've also seen the multi-core rosin, and I've had pretty good luck with the multi-core rosin to have it evenly distributed on the finest solder that I have. It's kind of impressive that they can get like 5 cores of rosin in the 0.47, I believe, is my finest solder. Does anybody else have any other questions, comments about solder or tips or stations or anything else in the soldering realm? Please call.
Zero ASP?
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I have, and I must use on specific occasions, lead-free solder, and I do not like it. Any suggestions on the best way to make a good solder joint using lead-free solder?
Yes, there is definitely some times when lead-free solder is going to be required. One time that I would point out is anything that's needed for food service isn't allowed to use leaded solder. So boards that are in like industrial refrigerators have to use like lead-free solder. So it's definitely a lot tougher to work with. You need more heat, and it doesn't tend to wick as well as leaded solder. Using extra rosin, flux has so cleaning the object really well, and then getting flux on both, and then using that extra heat. Generally, I would say that you're going to go between 350, 400 C for regular solder. You're gonna probably do 650, 700 for the silver or the non-leaded solder. But cleanliness and flux would be my biggest tips. Anyone else have some tips for the lead-free solder?
Basically, I would just say it's miserable, so I've never found any way to make it any better in zero PQ.
Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, Terry, but that stuff is difficult to work with, and I have yet to find a person that actually uses that stuff by choice.
Get would be the best. W0ASP, back to that.
No, I'm sorry, Terry. I doubled with you. You want to go again?
Terry, one.
Thing that I admit that the non-lead solder is difficult, and when it comes to cleaning flux, a flux brush, usually cut it down with a pair of scissors, and isopropyl alcohol will work well. The highest concentration you can get, and by the way, you can buy gallons of 99% and down at the Ace Hardware store in Longmont. W0ASB, back to net.
Yeah, good tip on that. The 99%. Good alcohol is definitely helpful. The higher content definitely helps cut through stuff. Yeah, and I had just said that that stuff is, the lead-free solder is definitely difficult to work with. I have yet to meet anyone that would work with that stuff by choice. Yeah. Any other comments on the solder, or we've gone over tips and soldering stations? Please call.
Well,
VRL.
but just a little bit of history here. W0LED.
This is Whiskey Zero, Delta Delta Zulu, net control for the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club, TechNet. We had a couple in there. We'll start with W0LEV. Dave, go ahead.
Yeah, here about a decade ago, the edict went out that lead shall be, well, Europe was responsible, lead shall be eliminated. Consequently, we got lead-free solder. There was a period of time in the formulation of lead-free solder that it got brittle, and that would break the contacts in a number of surface mount devices. It got reformulated several times, and now it's a little more pliable on variable temperatures. However, there's a group of electronics in that transition period that if they undergo continuous thermal stresses, cold, hot, warm, cold, they're liable to break. And unfortunately, you may see this in some of your PCs. The other comment I have in that respect, if you find leaded solder of the eutectic variety 6337, buy it now, because a lot of companies are dumping this stuff because they can't use it anymore by international edict. Buy it now, because in the future all you're going to be able to find is the lead-free solder, which is miserable to work with, to put it bluntly. Anyhow, bottom line, if you find the eutectic solder, buy it now. Stock up. W0LEV.
It's always a good idea to stock up on solder. That's anytime, really. WA5VRL, Willis, you had a comment. Please go ahead.
Yeah, very good. WA5VRL. Yeah, I got pulled away on a phone call, so I don't know what I missed, but I got back in here just a minute or two ago. I'll second what Dave said, and you can certainly, while the manufacturers of electronic subassemblies, etc., are required to do the lead-free solder thing, as was the place where I worked, there is nothing that says you cannot use regular lead eutectic solder to repair stuff, especially for ham radio stuff. just make sure you clean off the as much as possible the lead-free stuff before you remount something with leaded solder. And you can't clean 100% off because soldering is not the same as gluing something. When you glue something, the glue bonds to the two surfaces. It's a mechanical bond. With soldering, it actually forms an intermolecular bond between the solder and the metal surfaces, so you can never get it off 100%. It actually penetrates the molecular structure of the base metal, and it forms a solid metallic structure. So if you try to, even when it's wet or heated up, you try to wipe it off, you can't get it all. But if you clean it off decent, as much as possible, solder suckers, solder wick. If you get solder wick, make sure you get the stuff that has impregnated with rosin, because I've tried using the solder wick where you had to use separate flux, and it's just a nuisance to use, but it can be done. But anyway, you can use your tactic, like Dave said, stock up on the leaded solder wherever you can find it, and hoard it, or whatever you call it, because eventually it will become very difficult. Anyway, nothing else. I'm going to sign out of the net for this evening, and you guys carry on. Thanks again for doing the net, and hope everybody has a good day. And like I said before, if you want to do the soldering thing, a lot of practice time. WA5VRL.
Yeah, and thank you, Willis. Like I said earlier, I really appreciate you guys sharing your experience with us, because I don't get to solder as often as I'd like to sometimes. I definitely try to be practiced and try to know what I can, but your guys' experience definitely trumps mine, so I appreciate you being here. Did anybody else have anything to add or any questions about the solder, the tips, or the soldering stations? Please call.
N0PQ maybe with a couple more comments.
Yeah, please, Pete, go ahead.
So as far as the lead-free Ross initiative stuff goes, so far, leaded solder is still in production. We all expected it to go away, actually, a few years back, but it's still there. Kester and Multicore both still making it. You can get it at, Mauser, DigiKey, or wherever. Another thing I wanted to mention is in terms of flux formulations, there's also no-clean fluxes. And the no-clean fluxes don't work quite as well. Personally, I use them in solder paste for SMT reflow because it's just a lot easier and it works fine there. There's also fluxes which are kind of in between. One I use a lot for multicore is called Crystal. The idea behind it is it does leave residue, but it's clear. And they say you don't have to clean it off. Personally, I usually don't clean through all assemblies. The solvents can actually be kind of bad for some of the parts, but I usually do clean surface mount stuff. N0PQ.
Yeah, that excuse me. That is a good point. That some of those flux don't need to be cleaned off. It's definitely good to look though, because some of those can corrode the solder joint as time goes on, so it won't be immediate, but down the line you could end up with a problem. So it's always something to be aware of if you need to clean that off or not. Did anybody have anything else to add about stations or tips or solder?
W0ASP with another question.
Yeah, go ahead, Terry.
Been wonderfully detailed, and maybe it's driven too many people off, but the solder I have is 6040. Is that significantly different from the 6337 UTEC?
It's, it definitely doesn't sound like it's a huge difference, but it is. 6040 solder is not eutectic solder, so it will, as it's heating, it will hit that plastic phase, and before it hits the liquid phase, where the eutectic solder will melt at one point. So there is a range that you have to get above with the 6040 that in order to not get a cold joint, where the eutectic solder, it's an actual point. As soon as it goes liquid, it's ready to start cooling. You don't need to get it to any higher temperature than that. So it's almost impossible to get a cold solder joint with the eutectic solder, is one thing I've been told. So any other comments about the eutectic 6337 solder versus the 6040 solder?
Yeah, eutectic, it's virtually impossible to get it's possible, but virtually impossible to get a cold solder joint. 6040, it's easy to get a cold solder joint. You're absolutely right. W0LEV.
Yeah, it really does take a lot of the complication out of it to get it to the right temperature. If it melts, then it's at the right temperature. It's really neat solder. The first time I got to work with it, it definitely kind of surprised me how easy it was to work with.
Oh, Dave, bury me in an anthill and cover my face with jam. I certainly learned something today about the eutectic solder. W0ASP, back to net.
Great. I love these tech nets too. I always learn a bunch about a bunch. Were there any other questions or comments?
E0CF.
Hey, Ben, go ahead.
Well, this is probably not exactly hand-related, but has anyone tried soldering to aluminum? And what kind of flux would you need in order to make sure you get rid of that passivation layer on aluminum? E0CF.
I personally have never had luck with soldering to aluminum. How about any of you other guys? Does anybody have anything to help Ben out? Please call.
B.
Go ahead, Terry.
Do it. You have to make a mechanical connection.
Yeah, that doesn't really surprise me. Aluminum is just not very good at soldering.
Yeah, I heard a little bit comment about mechanical connection. Yeah, that would be nice. You get like a wire or something like that you can wrap around each other, and it will help a little bit. But yeah, I have this piece of aluminum I'd like to get a wire connected to, and unfortunately it will be on surface, so that's going to be really, really tough. I know that I could probably scrape the surface and try to solder it right away. That definitely would help, but I just wonder if there are any fluxes or something that I could easily make out of household chemicals to do that solder joint.
Yeah, aluminum solder requires special solder and special flux. Normal solder will not work. W0LED, and I need to clear for supper.
Yeah, I've definitely not been able to do it, but it sounds like Dave has had some experience with it in the past. Maybe catch up with him on the repeater later on, because that's interesting. Yeah, I'd definitely like to learn more about that. I've never had any luck soldering aluminum.
Yeah, okay, well, yeah, I'll have to think about that. This is actually, it's a kind of a strange issue. I'll not get into it for now. Anyway, I had one last comment about resistive soldering tips, at least soldering irons. That apparently there are two types. One that you can slip on metal tips onto your heating element, and there's also the type that have the heating element and the tip built into one. Well, I think the latter one would be kind of more expensive, but yeah, it is more expensive. But if you can find those that have them built together, those have better temperature control than the ones that are separable. Unfortunately, I don't have this type that I have it put together, but that's one of the problems I sort of have.
Oh, we lost the end of your transmission there, Ben. Ben's battery may have run out. Yeah, but he has a good point there. Let's see. So a few other things that I did want to bring up, or a few other things that your soldering station could have help your soldering station would be magnification. Magnification is definitely something that is helpful to inspect the joints and make sure that they look good after the fact, and to check and see how, or to be able to see your soldering as you're going. Some helping hands or some kind of a device to hold what you're working on. Some tweezers to hold like components, and tweezers should be stainless steel and non-magnetic. The solder sucker, we talked about that a bit tonight. The solder sucker can definitely be something that is helpful to have on your bench. Safety equipment, safety goggles, proper ventilation or a fume extractor. Those are definitely important considerations and things that are helpful. Does anybody else have any equipment that they want to add that is helpful by your soldering station, or any questions or comments about anything? Please call.
Chase.
AE0CF.
Thank you very much for all of your time and knowledge this evening. I'm a new technician licensed as of Saturday, and this is my first ever net, so thank you very much.
We had a bit of a double at the beginning there. I didn't catch the new technician's call. Please come again with that.
KE0UXQ, Steve. Just wanted to say thank you for the net and all of your knowledge tonight.
This is W0DDZ Net Control for the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. Yeah, Steve, thanks for joining us tonight. It's this is a fun net. We have a lot of guys around here that have a vast amount of skill in the industry, and it is always nice that they're willing to share that with us on a regular basis. Several of these guys are in the net every Monday, and I'll tell you, we appreciate them because they are a plethora of knowledge for sure. So, yeah, we're happy to be here for you, and thanks for joining us, Steve. Any other comments or questions for the net? It looks like we've gone a little long tonight, but that's okay. We always have some good stuff to talk about. Any other equipment or tips or anything to add about soldering, please call.
NC0PRB. What is a good recommended brand of that 6337?
So I wrote down Pete's recommendations from earlier, and that was Kester and multi-core. That's correct, Pete? Please come back.
Yeah, Roger, those are the two that I would recommend, and I use them both. I tend to use the Kester for really small surface mount and multi-core for everything else, and 0PQ.
And as I would also just reiterate that recommendation that the finest possible solder is always the best. Anything less than 0.5 is usually pretty good. Anybody else have anything to add or tips, questions? Please call.
U.S.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
Now, due to yesterday's falling injury on my butt, I have to sit down in my half-dugout house. But anyway, it should be obvious to the most casual observer, but no matter how in a hurry you are for soldering or for frying bacon, you should wear pants and closed shoes, no sandals. It just doesn't come out very, the outcome is not very good. KF4 to U.S.
Yes, proper clothing. Oh, and you know what? I just remembered that Ben had doubled with Steve. Ben, did you want to add something? Please come again.
Oh, yeah, nothing very much. Just wanted to open up another can of worms, and that's desoldering, but that might be something for some other time. Easier CF.
Yeah, desoldering is definitely another can of worms. It's definitely one that I know less about, which actually brings another recommendation of something that should be on your soldering station, which is solder wick. And I think somebody recommended earlier, and I definitely agree with it, is to get the solder wick impregnated with flux, it is vastly easier to use than the stuff without. Did anybody else have any questions, comments, or anything to add, tips, items that should be on the bench? Please call.
A1 DET.
Yeah, Mike, go ahead.
When I was going through my education for soldering, I was handed a junk PC board with parts on it, and I was told to remove them. My experience and the way I was taught was you need to learn to desolder so then that way you'll have a comprehension idea of how to solder. Yes, they're two different methods, but they are linked. You know, you've got to learn how to do one before you can learn how to do the other. You got to crawl before you can walk.
Yeah, you know, we've recently had the change. Kevin used to do all of our tech nets, and he was great at it. And in his absence, it takes 5 of us to keep up with what he did. So my next TechNet will be in another 5 weeks. So at that time, maybe I will do a part 2 where we can talk about desoldering and some soldering techniques. And it is a big subject. It's difficult to get it all in a single net for sure. Did anybody else have anything they wanted to add about soldering, solder stations, tips? We've covered solder itself, some equipment, some safety. Anything else that anybody has to add, please call. This is Whiskey Zero, Delta Delta Zulu, net control for the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club Net. And we've gone about an hour and a half, and we've gotten pretty quiet, so I think we'll bring it to an end. This is a good point to bring it to an end. Net Control would like to thank everybody for being a part of the net. It's definitely a lot of fun to hear from you all. There's a lot of experience around here, and I definitely appreciate you all being a part of the conversation and having a good topic like this to discuss. We do this net every Monday at 6 p.m. We also stream it to YouTube, so if you've missed the net or if you're not around a radio at the time, you can get it at youtube.com/NCARC. And it's good for reference. I definitely am one that goes back through and listens to the nets a few times to get all of the information that we talk about, because we talk about so many good things and cover so much, and I try to keep notes, but a lot of times I miss stuff. So definitely check out our YouTube channel if you get a chance. And if anybody else doesn't have anything else to add, I think we'll bring this net to a close. We'll do one last call for anything to add to the net before we close.
Zero ASP. Dave, you did a really good job. This is a very interesting topic.
Well, thanks, Terry. Yeah, it is a definitely an interesting topic, and it's one that I definitely like to talk about. So it's a pretty easy net to do when you like the topic, for sure. Well, thank you guys for all being a part and having the conversation. We definitely appreciate it. This is Whiskey Zero, Delta Delta Zulu, net control for this evening's Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club TechNet. I appreciate you all being here. We will be closing the net. You guys have a great night. The repeater is open for general use. W0DDZ. This presentation was brought to you by the Northern Colorado Amateur Radio Club. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe.